Imagining the Bay of Bengal as a Shared Space. This discussion will examine the Bay of Bengal as an interconnected strategic and developmental space, shaped by maritime cooperation, connectivity, and regional interdependencies. To lead this discussion, we are privileged to have the Director General of the NMF as host and discussant. Admiral Chauhan is accompanied by a stellar team of discussants: Ambassador Riva Ganguly, Rear Admiral Mukul Asthana, Professor Hindol Sengupta. I request our panelists to kindly join us on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a big hand.
Right, so thank you, Priyasha, once again. General and flag officers, ambassadors, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, once again, good morning. Let me afford you once again a very warm welcome, but this time to the session. Can you hear me well enough? Okay, anyway, the room is quite small. I wanted to offer you some opening kind of thoughts before we commence the session. And how we will run the session is that I will request each of my hello Sandeep, each of my fellow panelists to please offer some 4 or 5 minutes of succinct remarks in opening, and then we intend to not have this by a series of structured presentations, but really run it in the form of a conversation. And should you wish to participate in the conversation, so long as you don't take it over altogether, I'm sure we will be happy to accommodate some more untidiness. A few points that I did want to start off with. When we look at any space, whether it's the Bay of Bengal, which is our focus area today, or any other state, and we want to do something about it, then we must have quite a clear idea about what is our desired end state. One of the real problems in the ongoing conflict in the Persian Gulf is that there is very little clarity as to what was the end state that you desired before you started moving forces and ordnance into the equation. This is relevant to all the way to the Taiwan Strait, where once again China has to figure out what is the desired end state that it wants after incorporation of Taiwan. What is it thereafter that will happen, and what end state does China desire? Likewise, if we look at the Bay of Bengal, it is necessary for us to understand or to come to a conclusion of or to articulate our different views on what is the desired end state that we wish to see. If the desired end state is precisely where we are, then we need to do nothing. If we are going to look at some other desired end state, then it needs articulation clearly. We are currently living in extreme uncertainties because the Bay of Bengal cannot obviously exist in a vacuum on all of its own, unattached to the rest of the maritime spaces that surround it, both near and far. These have political uncertainties attached to them, they have economic uncertainties, there are cultural uncertainties and ethnicities that are uncertain as well. So there are, I'm always somewhat reluctant to reference an Indian conversation to President Trump. But so he should not be dominating our thought processes. And yet we are not sure about how this guardian of democracy is intending to look at the world going forward. Does President Trump's administration anyway, do they want geopolitical, do they talk about geopolitical rivalries, or are we talking about geopolitical confluence? Do we want a genuine balance of power, or do we want just 2 or 3 strong men who will govern the whole place? And if that latter happens, what happens to the agency of middle powers? How does all that bear upon the Bay of Bengal? If, for example, we apply exactly the same matrix but reduce the geographical range, what is it that we want in the Bay of Bengal? Do we want to have 1 or 2 countries who dominate and then everybody else just falls in line? Is that the desirable or desired end state? should it be that we have a multiplicity of views that coalesce in some areas without necessarily being subjugated by them? In other words, what about the agency of countries like Nepal, Bhutan, countries that rely upon the Bay of Bengal for their existence and their economic wherewithal, even though they are landlocked? What about countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, which lie on the eastern fringes of the Bay of Bengal? How much agency is required to be afforded to them? And surely this is a matter that needs some discussion. We are, of course, waiting for our third panelist to arrive, but in the meanwhile, and with these basic thoughts in mind, and also that if we're not going to be able to manage the Bay of Bengal, if we're not going to be able to manage these maritime spaces, then we are in for protracted conflict. And those days in which people used to say, future war will be short, sharp, and swift, are long over. And they were actually over even when they were being articulated as such in our various staff colleges. Have you not heard, how many times have you not heard the phrase, "Don't worry, the boys will be home before Christmas"? Have you realized they never tell you Christmas of which year? They never say this. There are no short wars. This is a figment of imagination, where imagination is itself constrained. So we here on this panel, in this session, we gather around a subject that is at once ancient and also urgently contemporary. The Bay of Bengal as a shared maritime space. And as each of our distinguished panelists and our learned audience is well aware, the Bay of Bengal is, of course, the largest bay in the world. It covers approximately 2.1 million square kilometers. Its littoral and its near littoral states host nearly 1.78 billion people, and they command a combined GDP of about 7.5 trillion US dollars. So this is not small potatoes that we are discussing. Nearly half of all global container traffic transits through the Bay of Bengal. And yet, for much of the post-independence era, this was considered a strategic backwater. Nobody really wanted to talk about it. A body of water that divided rather than united its neighbors. And that perception is changing at a speed that we are hard-pressed to keep up with. Today, the Bay stands at the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific, at the interspace of South and Southeast Asia. I'm actually unhappy with any comment that defines the Bay of Bengal as merely a link between South and Southeast Asia. The Bay of Bengal is more than just a link. It's more than just a bridge. It is an entity unto itself, and it has relevance and validity just by virtue of the countries that are more and more dynamic and which reside within it or on its fringes. So to help us navigate this somewhat complex and multi-layered subject, I am privileged to have with me three distinguished voices. The first, of course, is on my right, Ambassador Riva Ganguly, former Secretary to the Government of India and the Ministry of External Affairs, whose decades of diplomatic engagement with the region's capitals, especially Bangladesh, where she served with great distinction twice. The second time as India's High Commissioner, I think that was between 2019 and 20, as also the many richly deserved accolades that she received as the Director General of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, or the ICCR, as also, of course, the formidable reputation she enjoyed and enjoys as the former Secretary East within the MEA, and she will bring, of course, an invaluable policy perspective to our discussions. The second expert whom I wish to acknowledge before you with great respect and admiration is Rear Admiral Mukul Asthana, under whose sharp strategic eye maritime security is never an abstraction. Commissioned into the Indian Navy in 1986, he was awarded wings as a naval aviator who had moved in that classic fashion from the Merchant Marine into the Indian Navy. So he spent some time in the Merchant Marine as a young mariner, I think he served on as many as 4 merchant vessels before switching quite sensibly, I think, across to the Indian Navy. And there he was awarded his wings as a naval aviator in June of 1988 from the Air Force Academy, and has rich experience as a pilot. He's flown 4 types of aircraft and held operational and supervisory assignments in a number of Indian Naval Air Squadrons. He has also been, he is an alumnus of the Defence Services Staff College in Wellington, whose pin I'm currently proud to wear. I have 2 or 3 of these variants. Several of them are daggers, but since Hindol and I have decided that we're going to be married for life, I put my dagger away. The Naval War College, Mumbai, and the Bangladesh National Defence College in Dhaka. So there you are. You have expertise, both regional as well as functional, and he has had an admirable career within the Fleet Air Arm of the Indian Navy. Rose to its apex as the Assistant Chief of the Naval Staff Air. He was also the Director General of Project Varsha, and for those of you who are aware, Project Varsha is a project revolving around the development of highly classified infrastructure projects of our country in maritime terms. He is a recipient of the prestigious Nausena Medal and a highly respected scholar of international relations, strategic studies and research, and defense capability enhancement. And last but certainly not least is my 3rd panelist in the opening session and the co-host of this entire seminar, Professor Hindol Sengupta, a historian of repute, the co-founder of the international affairs publication and platform Global Order, and a much revered professor of international relations and the executive dean at the O.P. Jindal Global University. He's a prolific writer and the award-winning author of as many as 13 books. He was World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. He's still global, he's still young, and he's still a leader. I'm not sure why this is being explained in the past tense. But he has been a Knight Bagehot Fellow at Columbia University and a Chevening Scholar at the University of Oxford. Hindol, of course, reminds us that the Bay of Bengal has a civilizational memory that long preceded the nation state and the nation states that we now speak of. So he is not born in Bengal. He took birth and gave grace by that fact alone to Jamshedpur, which is now in Chhattisgarh. And then, like Mukul, who switched over from the Merchant Marine to the Indian Navy, he switched over from Chhattisgarh and grew up in Bengal. Jharkhand and grew up in Bengal, my apologies. And so he's quite aware that his area, both in terms of his area of interest as well as his area of growth as a young man, has acquired a centrality that even he, I dare say, till a few years ago might have been hard-pressed to enunciate quite so firmly. So, and now let me start the process, and let me start by engaging you, Professor Sengupta. And to begin, as historians must begin, at the beginning. So, although, as I've already said, you are justifiably proud of the very name of this Bay of Bengal, yet the Bay of Bengal is far older than Bengal as a political or even a cultural entity. And therefore, what does the sea mean historically to the people who have lived on its shores? What does it mean? And what should a 21st century policy discussion owe to that history? But while you reflect upon this question and the questions that follow, as I promised, I would first commence the session by allowing our panelists to deliver some 5 odd minutes of an opening overview. And for that, maybe I should turn to my right and give credit where credit is due and request Ambassador Riva Ganguly Das if she would commence the proceedings. Would you like to use this?
I think, is this audible? Yes. Yeah. Thank you, good morning, and thank you for inviting me, Professor Hindol Sengupta, Admiral Chauhan. Such a pleasure to speak to such a distinguished audience. I was very fascinated by what you said in the first session about geopolitics as an amalgamation of all cultural, civilizational links. And I think I would like to begin there because India really enjoys a very unique cultural, historical, civilizational link with this entire area. You talk about Laos, Vietnam, whole of Southeast Asia, you see footprints of India. And I think when you talk about imagining the Bay of Bengal as a shared space, that's where I would like to draw our attention to in the first instance. The Bay of Bengal has also long been viewed as a region having two important but distinct characteristics. It is seen on the one hand as very vital for as a socio-economic hub for the neighboring countries, and we know that the countries bordering the bay, including India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, etc., are heavily dependent on it for maritime trade, fishing, offshore resources such as oil and gas. And but on the other hand, we also see this region, the Bay of Bengal area, as a region which is seeing intense geopolitical rivalry, and no matter what happens to the various wars and what Minister Akbar talked about, the various seas, I think this is a reality which will stay with us for a long time, that the geopolitical rivalry of this region and the general desire of the smaller countries in the region not to get caught up in this, because they have other priorities, and this is not a competition or a contestation that they want to be involved in. So there is a lot of space for a country like India to shape its cooperation, collaboration, and its own vision of seeing the Bay of Bengal region as a shared regional commons and pursue its objectives through the various mechanisms that already exist. India has articulated its position very well through the Sagar Doctrine, security and growth for all in the region. And since 2025, we have the Mahasagar Doctrine, which is the mutual and holistic advancement for security and growth across the regions. It expands on India's earlier Sagar vision to cover the entire global south, not just Indian Ocean region. And while Sagar focused on maritime security and development in the Indian Ocean, Mahasagar has definitely broadened the concept and scope to include trade, security, development, cooperation across the global south. Now, Mahasagar, by that definition, also transcends boundaries and fosters a broader global south coalition by including many countries in the region. This is to align their economic and security policies with India's vision. So this offers opportunities for smaller states to participate in high-value trade networks, non-traditional security frameworks, and in a sense also it's a great counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is purely strategic in nature and connecting the BRI projects everywhere. So the core pillar of Mahasagar can be identified as trade for development, security cooperation and sustainable development. So India basically frames the Bay of Bengal as a zone of cooperation rather than conflict, and this vision is about transforming it into a cooperative maritime zone. So I'm not going to focus on the security aspect, which I'm sure the rest of the panel is going to cover in great detail. So with this in mind, India pursues its own, it wants to shape how BIMSTEC moves forward. BIMSTEC is a very important regional organization. It's, and India is a big player. We know, if you look at the history of BIMSTEC, we'll know that, how India perceives BIMSTEC and the political push that India gives to BIMSTEC gives it direction. There is the ASEAN, in India's vision of the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN is absolutely central. The IORA, and also let us not forget, when we talk about the Bay as a shared space, the bilateral and the regional initiatives that exist in this region in terms of the connectivity projects that India pursues with its neighbors, especially in the east, You take Bhutan energy cooperation. BIMSTEC talks about energy networks, and it is actually happening as we speak. The region buys and sells electricity from each other. There are the connectivity projects. So India is pursuing all its options through regional organizations and through sub-regional organizations and through its bilateral cooperation to pursue its vision of the Bay of Bengal as a shared space. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was both succinct as well as full of content. So let me turn then to Admiral Mukul Asthana and ask you if you've got 4 or 5 minutes of overview comments.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you all hear me at the back?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So, at the very outset, thank you, Hindol. Thank you, Admiral Chauhan, for inviting me, and especially Admiral Chauhan for speaking and introducing me to the audience. I'm not sure if I really am deserving those accolades. Actually speaking, I thought you were talking about somebody else. But let's come back to the topic. I think the Bay of Bengal, which is the world's largest bay, and some 2.6 million kilometers it comprises of. It's 2,100 kilometers long, north to south, and almost 1,600 kilometers east to west. It has 450 million diaspora, situated in 8 little states who directly are dependent on the bay for their food, income, and livelihood. There is almost 600 billion USD trade that happens through this bay, or very close south of the bay, and which comprises almost 25% of Indian trade and almost as much as 70% of China's gas and energy requirements. In fact, there's so much focus on the bay today, where I remember about 40 years ago when we were young cadets and young officers in the Navy, the Bay of Bengal was considered to be a rather wide backyard for India, and today it's one of the most hot happening places in the world. So, as a practitioner of for some time maritime trade, and later for the last 35 years as a practitioner of national security, maritime security, and flags and 7 or 8 issues which are important. And first of these is that the non-traditional threat density in this area, which includes drug trafficking, includes issues of immigration, and which largely include Rohingyas, the IUU fishing, and climate-induced humanitarian emergencies that happen at the drop of a hat in the Bay of Bengal. The Bay today is also a focus of intensifying Sino-Indian rivalry and the theatre for China's Belt and Road Initiative, both on the east as well as the west of India. There are also competing interests between India, Bangladesh, Myanmar with respect to the EEZ and continental shelf exploration, which are being addressed. Some have been addressed and sorted out at the International Court of Justice. There are some others which yet to be taken care of. India has 2 military commands in the Bay of Bengal. We have the Eastern Naval Command at Visakhapatnam and also our Tri-Service Command in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. As Admiral Chauhan earlier alluded to, there is much activity happening with reference to the military in the Bay of Bengal. We also have our shipbuilding centers which are developing the SSBNs in the Bay of Bengal. China, for that matter, is under the string of pearls encirclement of India, have got very many concerns for India. The Chokcho deep sea port in Myanmar, Chittagong port access to China, Hambantota port, which is on long lease in Sri Lanka, and also the presence of Chinese research vessels in the Bay of Bengal, which happen to keep coming in whenever India tests some of its latest missiles. Are causes of concern for our country. In addition to this, Japan is developing the Matawari port in Bangladesh. There is presence of extra-regional paths, including US Navy's aircraft, overflying the Bay of Bengal, many times without any FIC clearances, either from India or from adjoining countries in the Bay. And these sorties, of course, there's a name for this which they call due regard. That means they fly below the minimum en route altitude of the airliners and they fly with impunity. Add to that also the fact that many countries are carrying out exercises, some with India, some on their own, in the Bay. This includes Australia, Japan, France, and US. So, whilst the Bay of Bengal requires greater connectivity, cooperation, and collaboration among the BIMSTEC nations, the ambassador has alluded to, this area is also becoming very, very competitive and contested. Also, we must understand this Bay of Bengal is a very badly ravaged area weather-wise. The development of cyclones every year, particular seasons, and sometimes also the tsunamis which are caused over here, cause a lot of damage to life and limb of the diaspora staying here. And these are certain issues I thought I will flag. In fact, the Bay of Bengal is fast becoming what we actually call proverbial noodle soup bowl, where every country today in and around, some literals and some from the outside, find themselves attracted to and operate over here. So these are the various issues I thought I'd flag before we could discuss further.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so very much. Thank you. That was once again both filled with meaningful content, and thank you for sticking with the time. And let me therefore turn to our third stellar panelist and ask Professor Sengupta if he would give us, without touching on the question, if you would give us a broad overview in the next 4 or 5 minutes as opening comments.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, Admiral Chauhan, ladies and gentlemen. To me personally, the Bay of Bengal has deep resonances. I will touch upon the security issue and the Great Nicobar project and its importance later in what I'm going to say. But for now, let me just say this. Historically, today there is a conversation about the revival of Bengal. But in that conversation, we have forgotten what it is Bengal is being revived from. This implies that it must have been something good in the past which it wants to go back to. How did that good thing that Bengal was in the past, in fact the entire eastern belt of India was in the past, Ongo, Bongo, Kolingo from our ancient civilizational text, how did this entire region, especially Bengal, become that good thing, that place of wealth at the heart of trade and commerce? We have to remember that Bengal's strength as one of the cornerstones of trade and commerce in our part of the world came because of trade from the Bay of Bengal. You cannot talk about, as a Bengali, as people thinking about great economic and trade figures from our history, people like Dwarkanath Tagore or Bati Seal or a range of these people. You cannot think about all of them. You cannot think about the wealth of the house of Jagat Seth without thinking about the trade that happened in the Bay of Bengal. That wealth, that commerce is irretrievably intertwined with these waters. If there was no Bay of Bengal, there would not be this wealth. This is absolutely critical to understand. When we talk about the Renaissance of Bengal and the industrialization at that time of Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore's great dream of bringing British industrialization, so to speak, on the banks of the Hooghly, what was he basing it on? He was basing it on his family's history of deep trade in these waters. And yet, even today in India and including in Bengal, this conversation happens as if the Bay does not exist. As if this trade happened in isolation. And that is a grave, great mistake. And this has happened because of long years of absolute disrepair, where we have forgotten places like Murshidabad, we have forgotten places like Chandanagar, we have forgotten our own history. And this history, this is an opportunity in India to rebuild on this history once again. But again, I want to put to you, this history cannot be rebuilt unless we put this bay front and central at the heart of our imagination for a new Ongo Bongo Kolingo. I will expand on these comments later, but for now, this is my core point. The bay is central to our imagination of reviving India's eastern frontiers.
Well, thank you very much. That was quite passionate and quite correct as well. So thank you. Listen, guys, this is a conversation. So if you're waiting for these complex presentations with PowerPoint, I'm afraid this is not one of those. So unfortunately, we're seated in a convex arrangement rather than a concave one. But from your perspective, consider yourselves to be part of this. So Hindol, let me move you along the lines that you already spoke about. First of all, I still want to ask you, given that the Bay of Bengal is older than Bengal as a political or even a cultural entity, what once again does this sea area mean historically to the people who have lived on its shores? Was it only a trading entrepot collection? Were there intrinsic activity, social, cultural, economic, that are endemic to the peoples of that particular of this particular maritime space? And also equally complicated is that history records how colonial rule, first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then ultimately the British, transformed the bay into an instrument of imperial extraction. And then, of course, came partition. And you yourself, in an earlier discussion with me, I know, have described that period as one that severed connections that had organically developed over centuries. And so how does that rupture then cast a shadow over the present day Bay of Bengal and its cooperation? What is this Bay of Bengal finally about? Is it about the security of India alone? Is it about the cultural renaissance of the region as a whole, of a sub-region as a whole, because now the sub-region is subsumed into a larger region called the Indo-Pacific? And even when we talk about the Indian Ocean, I'm always trying hard to convince people, when you say the Indian Ocean, please say it's the western segment of the Indo-Pacific. When you talk about the Pacific Ocean, please say it's the eastern segment of the Indo-Pacific. If we don't believe in the Indo-Pacific at all, let's drop it. But if we do believe in it, then let's put our money where our mouth is, or at least our words where our mouth is. So, Hindol, would you be able to tell us something about your perspectives on these issues? Thank you.
Thank you. I would be delighted to. I think of the question you've just asked me, Admiral, as the two C's that define this region: cosmopolitanism and contestation. You cannot think about one without the other. Let me take a point that parochial Bengalis are usually very proud of, that we are very cosmopolitan. We embrace, you go to Calcutta, they will tell you, well, we have Armenian restaurants even today, and we have Baghdadi this and this, that and the other. All of this international influence, if I were to call it that, came via this route. Not just trade and commerce, but also culture. I'll give you one example. Recently, I was in Kolkata. I went to eat at one of the most sort of celebrated restaurants in Calcutta. Young chef, new restaurant, being featured in Condé Nast and so on and so forth. He told me he had begun using cheese from Chandanagar. Where did cheese come to Chandanagar? Who brought cheese to Chandanagar? How did it even develop there? You cannot but ask this question. However, I must add, with this cosmopolitanism, there is a deep-seated history of occupation, ostracization, colonialism that cannot be, you cannot divide the two. What happens is, on one hand, we want to celebrate some of these things. On the other hand, we are extremely angsty about this. And both exist simultaneously. We are oddly very proud of our cosmopolitanism, we in the East, but we cannot bifurcate it from this deep sense of contestation that exists in our history. Because colonialism broke many things that was natural, including the point you made, Admiral, broke natural geographies into two. Geographies that have been naturally together for a long, long time. Let me come to the security aspect for a moment then. One of the questions I asked many of my friends within government and outside, and I'm yet to find an answer, is a question a Bangladeshi High Commissioner used to ask us about 10 years ago. The question is the following. As global warming impacts the Bay of Bengal and waters begin to rise as they are, displacement will happen in this region, in Bangladesh. When this displacement happens, anywhere between 2 to 10 million people, depending on who's making the assessment, will have to move. Where will these people move? By all assessments, many of these people will move towards the border of the boundaries of India into what is today West Bengal, in a region where we are now trying to finalize the border of the last 600 kilometers. Now, any population moving in large numbers towards India, India will have no choice but to embrace these climate refugees. Till date, I am yet to hear of a single person give me a coherent answer on what India's strategy for this future happenstance will be. Even though we're a country where so much conversation is happening about immigration, illegal immigration, all kinds of things, we do not have an answer. And this stares us on the face. We have to address this question. We have to have a plan B. I don't believe, maybe there is a plan, I don't know of it. And I first heard this more than 10 years ago. Subsequently, I've asked lots of people, but there is no answer. Number two, let me take off from what Mr. Akbar was saying. As always, I am a generation which saw many people in India speak very passionately against the fact that India would develop nuclear weapons. Now, of course, I believe, in my opinion, that that's one of the most important strategic things India did for its own security. Today, we are again hearing voice after voice in Delhi and otherwise saying that the Great Nicobar project should not be built. I am not for a moment saying that environmental concerns should not be taken into account. However, I want to place this, and I've said this to Admiral Chauhan and others, I wish to place this before all of you. In my opinion, we are a country where the general public space, public conversation, has very little idea or concern for our own security and sovereignty. Indians believe that this map is eternal, our security and sovereignty. Why we believe that, God only knows, considering we have constant conflict, but many Indians believe this. And we speak as if we are in one of the safest places in the world. We have no contestation, we have no problems. We must understand one simple thing, and I'm sorry to sound passionate about this. Are we going to embrace that we need to secure our sovereignty and security at the cost? There's always going to be a cost. There is always a cost to secure the security of your country. Are we willing to pay some cost or not? If we are not willing to pay that cost, then history will define what happens to us. Are we willing to pay a cost to, as Mr. Akbar said, finally we have a forward strategy? Are we willing to defend our security and sovereignty? And what are we willing to pay the price to defend it? If these questions remain amorphous for us, remain romanticized for us, then there is a price to pay. We are still paying it. We will pay it in the future. I think for the first time, including in my home state of Bengal, these questions are being debated in coffee shops. These questions are being debated in universities. You go to Calcutta, you talk to people, people will tell you that they think about these questions. For the first time, all these years, nobody cared. I think we are at a turning point in history. These waters will be supremely important. I think lots of new things will happen there. These debates will happen. Of course, there will be debate. We are we're a raucous country. We're 1.5 billion people. Of course, there's going to be debates. But I think there are critical issues that we need to understand as Indians about our own security and sovereignty.
Yeah, thanks. That's true. I'm sure that you've ignited many thoughts in many minds. And before I turn to Ambassador Das, let me just touch upon this one issue that you mentioned, this commencement of climate refugees, and where will these various displaced people actually fetch up? If sea level rises to a point of 1 meter by the end of this century, we will have areas of coastal Bangladesh which are inundated up to a distance inland of 100 kilometers. Where will these people go? So some of them, Bangladesh says that we've got some plan and they'll move laterally and be absorbed internally. But you are right, there is a security question. And the fact that you say that we have a strategy brings into question another point. That is all wisdom resident in South Block or North Block? First of all, is South Block a noun or a verb? That itself is confusing to me. Very frequently I think it's a verb. The whole idea is to block anybody's approach to anything within it. But on a more serious note, you bring out a question of communication. How badly does the government of India communicate with the people of India? Or how well? I think the first option was better. How badly do we do it? Because we seem to have a gradation of badly communicated projects. The fact that we have much debate is valid, and it's good. The fact that most of this debate is ill-informed is not so good, because then we end up in cacophony. But let me not hog the stage at all, and let me turn to Ambassador Riva Ganguly Das and ask you, Ambassador, you already spoke about BIMSTEC, but the Bay of Bengal has countries outside of BIMSTEC, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, for example. But they're not BIMSTEC members, but they're deeply integrated to the Bay's economic and security architecture. And India has elevated its relationships with many of them to strategic partnerships of one or the other grade. Singapore and India have a vibrant relationship. So how can India better manage this broader geometry, what we might call the Greater Bay of Bengal? How do you see India's relations with these South Asian states? And while you bring that into the conversation, I also wanted to ask you, what do you think what should be the role of India? How should India look at itself? Once again, I ask this provocative question: should we be the Dada of the Bay of Bengal? Yeah, I can see some people nodding vigorously.
Yeah.
But is that going to lead us to where we want to go? Which begs the question, ma'am, where is it that we want to go? Thank you.
Thank you. Lot of questions raised, and you've taken the risk of putting two Bengalis from the same part of the world in the same panel and to speak on the Bay of Bengal. I think that was a very risky decision. But just to add to your cheese story of Chandanagar, there is also another cheese from Bandil, Portuguese colony, which is very rare, very special cheese, which is available in only one shop in Newmarket, and it's a very interesting these cultural things that still exist. And just one point, I'll come to your question also, on what you mentioned, Professor Sengupta, that the whole thing you so passionately described about the Bay of Bengal. Let's consider today that just look at the northeastern states of India. They had centuries-old links with the Bay of Bengal. These were their trade routes, not for 20 years, not for 30 years, for centuries. The entire prosperity of the Greater Bengal region before the British came and during, even predating the Mughal period was dependent on the access to Bay of Bengal. what did partition do? Cut them off completely from the Bay of Bengal. So I'll answer your last question first, which is that, India is committed to its own economic development. Obviously, your foreign policy is centered around your prosperity, economic development, Atmanirbharta as we call it. So there, Bay of Bengal, access to the bay plays a very, very important role, because we cannot move forward as a nation. We cannot have these larger aspirations unless we take everybody along, and we know that the northeastern states have fallen behind. So, India has used the various options, including the Bay of Bengal, the BIMSTEC, to improve connectivity in this region. Obviously, Northeast is a place where, some of India's most important foreign policy objectives, neighborhood first, Act East, everything sort of, converges there. And if you look at, in fact, the government of Assam actually has a department called Act East Department, and the government of Assam is very active on this, as they feel that they are the real gateway to ASEAN, to this vibrant, economically developed region of ASEAN. So in a way, the mandates of BIMSTEC and ASEAN can be looked at together, because it's a very, very broad canvas. I will just take, say, perhaps, what India has, the responsibility that India has in BIMSTEC, which is counter-terrorism, transnational crimes, disaster management, energy security. So these are areas where India can do a lot. And in the BIMSTEC, because of India's size, India's prominence in the region, naturally the other countries look up to India for leadership. And we all know that when India did the 2016 outreach, with the BIMSTEC countries, that was a very big turning point in how BIMSTEC moved forward from there. So it's true that, while BIMSTEC will be completing 30 years next year, and presently the presidency is with, the chairmanship is with Bangladesh, and I think if you see the alphabetic order, probably it will go to Bhutan after that. And but even though it's a very low profile organization, little is known about it outside BIMSTEC. It has done phenomenal work. It is now a legal organization. It has its own charter. It has the master plan on connectivity. I see there is a session on master plan in connectivity. Can you imagine, the entire regional countries have actually agreed to a master plan, and it's an evolving document. It's not written in stone. Every country can give their own little projects to it later. And this is something which can, completely change the economics of that region, increase per capita incomes, increase the livelihoods, improve the livelihoods of the people, and bring the connectivity, because we all know South Asia is the least connected area in the world, while, ASEAN, intra-ASEAN trade is about 30%. South Asia trade is barely 5%. Despite India giving SAFTA, facilities to a lot of our neighbors. So altogether, I think in terms of the security concerns are definitely there, but the economics of what we are trying to do, that India is trying to do through the BIMSTEC mechanism and through its Act East policy with ASEAN, where it overlaps in the Kaladan multimodal project, the India, Myanmar, Thailand, the trilateral highway, and our proposal to extend the highway up to Vietnam and Laos. These are all game changers, and the growth of the upcoming ports.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. I just wonder whether we should be looking at security and economics still as two discrete silos. I think that we by now have acquired sufficient understanding to recognize that they are nothing without the other. And I also wanted to ask one more thing for you all to mull over while I turn to Admiral Asthana, and that is that when we talk about culture, why does all our culture have to be highbrow culture? In all our Mahatma Gandhi institutes, for example, it is all highbrow. But India is not about highbrow culture alone. India is a good amalgam of local, domestic, folk, all of that. Shouldn't there be shouldn't our foreign office be more aligned towards bringing all of India and not just Robindra Sangeet or, there is no way that we can diminish the value of that. But there's also a need to reach out to the peoples of the region in a more lowbrow fashion. So I just wonder about these two things, about economics and security on the one hand, and this culture thing on the other. But let me turn to Admiral Mukul Asthana, who has spent a professional lifetime thinking about the sea from a strategic and a military perspective. So let me ask you directly here. Mukul, is the Bay of Bengal, in your opinion, a shared space or is it a contested space? And how has India's strategic posture in the Bay evolved over the past decade? Do we have this is an even more important question. Do we have a strategic culture? That means, do we have a culture? Yeah, we have a culture. Then have we got some mechanism by which we will leverage that culture? Some strategy, then we have a strategic culture. So perhaps you could wrestle with both elements of this.
So I think, sir, the simple short answer to your first question is yes, it is both. As much for security, as much for connectivity and cooperation. But as even the ambassador alluded to, that both have to go hand in hand. One cannot be seen in isolation in itself. Your second part of the question is that
shared or contested?
So it is both, actually, shared and contested. And that is how it's going to be in the future, all the time. Does India have a strategic culture? I'm sure India has a strategic culture. As a matter of fact, only last year the Navy's official doctrine spoke about the Bay of Bengal as no war, no peace doctrine. So it's always contested. There are a lot of issues which need to be handled, but they will go along together and it has to be worked out in an even manner. And that is how I think our Navy and the nation, the militaries are preparing for this. Both on the fronts of trade, cooperation, as well as on security.
You've described India's hard power architecture pretty well, I think. Thank you. But the Bay of Bengal is also home to a whole array of non-traditional security challenges, armed robbery, IUU fishing, drug and arms trafficking, human trafficking, and increasingly the consequences of climate change. And these are not limited to any one country within the Bay of Bengal. Anything that happens in both these areas of IUU fishing and climate impacts everybody. Thailand more recently had taken up the stewardship or the leadership of how to handle fishing within the Bay of Bengal and within the BIMSTEC construct. So how does the Indian Navy and the Ministry of Port, Shipping and Waterways and the Department of Fisheries, all three of which are equally relevant to these discussions, how do they position themselves? How does the Indian Navy position itself as a first responder to non-traditional threats, particularly in cooperation with coast guards of other regions, its own coast guard? How do we resolve the problem of coast guards having jurisdiction of place? It's not so simple to have coast guard gatherings and meetings, because each coast guard has a different jurisdiction of space. But specific to the Bay of Bengal, is there any approach that we haven't thought of or that you could suggest for us to think about?
So I think it's a very pertinent question, sir, and I must say that India and the Indian Navy, by virtue of its potential, the size, and the number of platforms it is able to field and operate from the Bay of Bengal, be they surface ships or aircraft, is most suitable for being the preferred security partner, as we like to call it today. And we've seen that whenever there are calamities in the littorals, more often than not, and I say more often than not, Indian Navy is the first responder to that. And this also actually, if you see, since you mentioned about the IUU and the displacement of people, immigration, in the charter of BIMSTEC, India has been given the responsibility of looking after and safeguarding these issues by virtue of the fact that I mentioned that we are a larger navy in the area. And whatever developments for the navy and for the ports that we are going to have in the future, including the GNI, I think the littoral nations need to see that as a very benign kind of a move, which would eventually be useful and helpful to all of them as much as we can. Coming to your last part, sir, about the Coast Guard, the interaction of Coast Guard, we know that the navies meet at Milan and IORs at various places, various times. I think we need to have more joint exercises between the Coast Guards. And there is also necessity perhaps to do Indonesia and BIMSTEC, so they're so close to us.
I couldn't agree with you more on the last point. I'm not sure about the Coast Guard having combined exercises, but it's a matter for us to discuss. But what I really wanted to take off and bring to you, Hindol, is the fact that once again, we seem to have a requirement for internal and regional communication. This communication, this lack of adequate communication, the lack of information, which is credible information and isn't reduced only to sloganeering or developing acronyms of one or the other kind. It is necessary for us to be able to build a confidence level amongst our people that we are actually all moving together in some regional fashion, in addition to obviously having primacy in each country for its own economic well-being of its own people. So if you look at the Bay of Bengal's littoral, it's, as has already been mentioned, it is one of the most climate vulnerable regions on the earth. Sea level in the North Indian Ocean is rising at rates exceeding the global average. States like Odisha, West Bengal, international states like Bangladesh are all facing intensifying risk from extreme weather events, and the Sundarbans, which is the world's largest mangrove ecosystem shared by India and Bangladesh, is already under existential threat from precisely this kind of desire to build hard infrastructure rather than look at other nature-based or eco-based infrastructural approaches. So is there a civilizational dimension to all this crisis, and can shared ecological vulnerability become a foundation for a new and more urgent form of regional cooperation? Can we at least leverage the fact that misery loves company to make sure that the region actually sits together and talks about things that are commonly experienced by each of them? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll take off from what Mukul Asthana ji was saying. And you also mentioned, you agreed with him. Most Indians don't realize, as they look towards London and New York and California, that both for their tourism purposes, leisure, and for business, that do you know that Indonesia has a larger e-commerce market today than India? I see this because we almost at a level do not recognize the opportunities that are relatively lying close by from us in that part of the world. We are so consumed with always looking towards one direction that we don't realize. I said this recently to somebody from the world of business, that do you know, who was talking to me about e-commerce in India, that do you know Indonesia's market in e-commerce is larger than India? Most people who work in e-commerce in India do not know this. And that to me is a tragedy. Most people recognize that Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos were very wonderful, cheap but wonderful places to visit once Goa began to crumble. And yet, my point is, we don't have to see a point where we cannot go to Goa because it's too expensive or many of the things are going wrong there, to recognize that from Calcutta, it's probably easier, faster and quicker and indeed cheaper to go to some of these places than to go to Goa. So this lack of recognition of the ecosystem that lies in this part of the world for us is really vital, and it must be recognized. Many Indians do not recognize, again, that for all the talk about civilization, one of the great connections of that civilization are the great temples of Angkor Wat. And it's never in most itineraries of bucket lists of places to see before a person dies, you will not see Angkor Wat, even though it's one of the most fascinating things to see. You will not see that in most Indians' list. So we have, for some strange reason, we have cut ourselves away from what is really, in a sense, our neighborhood. I think today there is really a lot of importance must be given to reviving those things. You mentioned common problems of climate change. The cutting of Bangladesh and the cutting away of Bangladesh, we discussed earlier also, was a great tragedy in many ways. Do you know, in the Sundarbans, for all the talk about differences between religion, in the Sundarbans, I was recently there because I'm writing a book about worship of feminine divine. There is a goddess called Ma Monosha, which is shared on both sides, the Bangladesh side and the Indian side. Hindus and Muslims and anybody else who's there in that ecosystem, whether it's Ma Monosha or there is Bon Bibi, which is the goddess of the forests. And please note that one is Ma Monosha, giving it a Hindu sort of terminology. The other is Bon Bibi, giving it a sort of Muslim terminology. And yet these are all commonly accessed divinities of those mangroves. Another history that we rarely know. Yes, it is true that Amitabh Ghosh wrote a beautiful book about this called The Hungry Time, but even today most people don't know this. So there are many of these things that are natural to the ecosystem, natural to the geography, natural to the local imagination. But somehow for the rest of us in India, we have very little understanding of this ecosystem. However, may I end with a positive note? I do believe it's beginning to happen. In the last 10 years, I've had more friends in Calcutta tell me that they're going for holidays in different parts of Southeast Asia than ever before. As you know, all Bengalis love to go to London if they can afford it in summer. But many of them are also now choosing to go to other parts, especially in Southeast Asia. And that, I think, on a funny but a happy note, that I think is a positive development.
Yeah, thank you. And would you like to take off from where Hindol, not the last one, not the difference between going to London and going elsewhere, but all the issues about how do we manage to move this culture thing? How do we amalgamate these things? Why is it necessary for us to discuss security in these grim tones and culture in these joyous tones? Why can't we have a conversation on both?
I think we certainly can and we should have, because as you yourself mentioned in the first session, that there is an amalgamation of all of this, and it's very obvious what the connects are. But I would like to just mention, because Professor Sengupta mentioned about, we know so little about what's going on around us. We have to recognize that, we live in a social media world. Here people are consuming information from reels and from 70-worded tweets and, from the X. You cannot reduce 1,000 years of history and nuanced foreign policy aspects into those 70 words and still communicate a coherent message. So what governments do, I myself was in public diplomacy in the Ministry of External Affairs, and it was, social media was just about coming up, and I think we very successfully used social media. But you have to see social media along with the fact that there is a lot more interest in foreign policy amongst the common people. Certainly the middle classes, because everybody is, relative, somebody or the other is abroad, somebody is studying abroad, so you are always interested in what's going on. And also foreign policy has become much more an aspect of a domestic discourse. It's very much a part of domestic discourse. So no, but given the interest, there is no patience to actually go into, every foreign policy decision has behind it years of historical, communication, years of history, years of nuancing. That is very difficult to communicate. I accept that, it is really, really difficult to communicate. But I think all governments can work with stakeholders and do a better job of it. Because here stakeholder, you did mention about South Block, having been a resident there for many years, I have to say that, even though it is not often visible, but stakeholder, in today's world, you cannot take policy decisions without stakeholder involvement. After all, if you do an, say, investment agreement with a foreign government, who are you doing it for? For investors, for business people. So you can only create the enabling environment. It is the business people who have to take advantage of it. So I think, I don't know if I was explaining.
Yes, absolutely. So the only problem is that I have some hard stares coming from the MC and her companions, so clearly we are running out of time.
So can I just...
Yes, of course you must.
Just 2 minutes of yours. In fact, I must commend you for this very special panel. You mentioned 2 Bengalis. I think there are more than that. Because when I finished my NDC after 11 months, they certified me to be a half Bengali.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we began this conversation with a historian reminding us that the Bay of Bengal has been a conduit of civilization for multiple millennia. A diplomat showed us how painstaking and fragile the architecture of regional cooperation currently is, and how we are progressively strengthening that both internally and externally. And a naval officer and strategic analyst has described the sea as it really is today, a space of genuine strategic competition as well as cooperation, a shared space as well as a contested one, where each country's maritime interests must be defended with hardware and doctrine and not merely aspiration, because as every officer here knows, hope is not a strategy. And so what emerges from this conversation, I think, is a layered truth that the Bay of Bengal is indeed a shared space in history, in ecology, in economic interdependence, in cultural memory, but it is not yet a governed shared space. And how should we then bring about this business of governance? Once again, what model of governance should we have? Top down, bottom up, lateral, or all of the above? And if so, what structures should we recommend? Because the purpose of these seminars is not for us to talk to one another alone, but hopefully to be able to distill from this some policy recommendations which will appear as new ideas to be accepted or to be discarded by policymakers. And since policy is made by government, I think that it is necessary for us to be able to convey these messages across to government. And there's no use telling government general things that the government already knows, because the government is mostly generalists. And if our views are going to, if as specialists we are going to be able to only perform the duty of providing general inputs to generalists, then our value addition is 0. Of course, our comfort level might be 100%. But we do need to find this, and this distillate is what I think that emerges from this conversation, that we need to be able to put it together in a 1 or 2 pager and send it across to the government. And I'm sure I will be happy to join Professor Sengupta in this endeavor and be supported by my fellow panelists. And all that remains to be done is for me to ask you to join me in expressing our gratitude to our